I'm Mike Guertin. I'm here with Justin Fink, and we're going to start the presentation on flashing a deck ledger. And Justin and I only put this together, what, on Tuesday?
We moved quick around here.
Yeah, it's a lot different than the old days where I'd write an article and it wouldn't show up for 2 years. So that's a good thing. Some of the things beforehand, and you might add to this, Justin, is Fine Homebuilding just recently launched on their website a project guides, which is, and the first one, I guess, is on decks. And what it is it's kind of a accumulation or a reorganization, or actually an organization of all of the articles, videos, blogs, and other things that have been produced on finehomebuilding.com or on in the magazine that we have put together so that they live in one spot and are much easier to navigate through. So this is just a screenshot of the website.
Right.
You have anything to add? You want to add to that, or?
This thing just went live a couple of weeks ago. It's brand new, so everybody should go check it out. We've changed our membership model on the site so you can see a bunch of everything for free for the first few articles before you get hit with a prompt to start a trial subscription. So for anybody who before couldn't get to certain pieces of content until you were a member, now you can see everything, at least for the first few articles. So all of these articles are up for grabs right now. And we've freed up a bunch more recently because we know how many people are stuck at home right now and looking for entertainment and education.
That's good. And is there going to be a blog that was associated with this, or some kind of a forum that'll be associated with it, or is that something that's pie in the sky?
We're still working on it. It is just for right now, we're focused on getting some of these webinars out, and then we're going to pivot back to the forum.
Now, one thing I want to point out is under where it says decks, it says trusted comprehensive guide for building decks that are durable, code compliant, and beautiful. That code compliant part, take that with a grain of salt. I was reviewing some of the content on there last night, and it's not 100%. So most of it is, but we got to tweak some of that, I guess.
Yes, it's always a work in progress. But everything you're going to talk about today is code compliant.
Pretty much, yep, and well beyond code. And to that end, Fine Homebuilding's got a lot of resources. Some of what I talk about here is stuff that we've already done videos or articles on, in whole or in part. So this is one of them. It was part of the shop class video series we did in the spring. This was how to install and flash a deck ledger start to finish. So you can find that in that deck section on the project guide. That'll be right on the homepage of Fine Homebuilding. Here's another one from a deck that Justin and I built about in 2012. So that was 8 years ago now. It seems like yesterday. So the process is pretty much the same there as well. So I want to harken back a little bit to code things just to give us some grounding on what the code calls for and what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us, because a lot of things in the code can be confusing, or in some events you don't actually know where to find the parts that apply to deck ledgers. So there's one table, well, a lot of tables in the code. I'm going to be referring to the 2018 International Residential Code, mainly because it's the most current, though we'll be coming out with the 2021 code by this coming August or so. It'll be available, and I expect this to be the same. But this in the 2018 code has been the same since, I think, 2009. The only portion of the deck code that refers to flashing is a footnote to the table that we find the spacing for the fasteners, 1/2 inch through bolts and lag screws. And down at the bottom it says in that footnote, ledgers shall be flashed in accordance with section R703.4 to prevent water from contacting the house band joist. So it doesn't tell us like specifically what to do. Like a lot of the code portions, it'll tell you how many nails to put somewhere. It'll tell you how big something has to be or how to install it. This just gives us a performance criteria. Then when we go and look at 703.4, there's a couple things that you want to pay attention to. One of them, and that well, let me just go through this quickly. It wants a corrosion resistant flashing installed shingle fashion, which means the upper part's going to go over the lower part, just naturally the way you want to shed water mechanically. And it's there to prevent water from getting into the wall cavity and damaging any of the structural framing components. Self-adhered membranes can be used as flashing, but they have to comply with an AAMA, an AMA standard. Most of the flashing tapes that you find used for window flashing tapes would actually fulfill that requirement. And the same with a lot of the roofing membranes. Even if it's not specifically designed for decks, you can use those as well if you do decide to use them. And you can also use fluid applied membranes. But the important part I want to point to, and this is what I'll be kind of showing in the slides, is that it says a flashing shall extend to the surface of the exterior wall finish. So in other words, when we flash that ledger, we have to think about not only the top of the ledger and flashing over to the top, but we also have to think about what's happening at the bottom of the ledger, under the ledger. It's not so much the case if you're building a grade level deck, but if you're building a deck that's going to have siding beneath it, say it's got a stem wall beneath it, or it's a deck on a second floor, then you're going to want to pay close attention to how you flash that. And then there are a bunch of other little conditions and locations where we have to use or install flashing. And number 5 in that list, I'm not listing the whole list here, it says where exterior porches, decks, or stairs attached to the wall or floor assembly of wood frame construction. So it just, again, it kind of parallels what it said in that little footnote to the table in the code. Then if we go a little bit further into and this is only in the 2018 code, in the deck code portion, it says a flashing shall be corrosion resistant metal of nominal thickness, not less than 19 thousandths of an inch, which is roughly 26 gauge metal, or approved non-metallic material that is compatible with the substrate of the structure and the decking materials. The important thing there, and why it's italicized, is approved. So that whenever you see approved in a code section like that, that means approved by the local official. So the local official has some authority there when it comes to which flashings we can use. And in some cases, there are some self-adhered membrane style flashings, which are, by the manufacturer's standpoint, they are approved for use as primary flashings. But it still would need the thumbs up from your local official. And that's a good thing to clarify with them before you actually start flashing a deck, if they're going to be doing an inspection on that. This is just an illustration of what I'll be going into. This was from an article we did, or I did in Professional Deck Builder a number of years ago. But I'll go through that here in steps. So if anybody's got questions as we're going through this, feel free to type them in. If I don't catch them right away, I'll come back to them a little later on.
I'll try and stay on top of the questions, Mike, and read them to you as they come in.
Okay, thanks. So first thing is a head flap in the weather-resistant barrier. So presuming you have a house wrap or tar paper on the wall, even if it's an existing house where you've pulled back the siding, you're going to want to expose a couple courses of siding above where the ledge is going to go, so you can tie into that water-resistant barrier. Now, if you're using a sheathing integrated, or I should say a WRB integrated sheathing, like a coating that's on like GP's Force Field or Zip system from Huber, or the Weather Logic from LP, you'd be just surface applying a lot of these things and then weather lapping them in with some fluid applied later on. I won't get into those details. I'm going to stick with the more common fabric style WRB, and then you can extrapolate. So what I like to do is put a piece of membrane, a sheet that's going to go where the ledger goes. So let me go back one slide. I'm going to cut out the area where the ledge is going to go roughly. So I snap 2 chalk lines over the house wrap, and then I've cut out that portion, and then from that upper line that would have been snapped right about maybe 6 inches down from where you see the head flap going up. Then I cut out a head flap, fold it up out of the way, tape it up out of the way. Then I'm going to apply a piece of peel and stick behind the ledger. That's going to be my backup and my security policy to prevent the water from getting into the wall in the event anything happens to my flashing system above. So the sheet that I cut is going to be 3 to 5 feet long. Now, usually I work alone or just with my brother or with a helper. And though you can apply the membrane and roll it out across your whole area where the ledge is going to go, I find it's a lot easier just to work in wingspan length pieces, 3 to 5 feet wide, something you can manage, especially if it's a hot day in summertime. You don't want to be dealing with something that's sticky. It's going to get stuck in the wrong spot because you want to have as much control as possible. Now the sheet itself, I make it 3 inches to 6 inches wider or taller than the height of the ledger board. So if I was using a 2x8 ledger, which is nominally about 7 inches, I'll make this at least 10 inches and maybe up to 12 or 14 inches tall overall. And then I'm going to take, and what you see me doing here is I'm going to take a straight edge and a very sharp knife, and I'm going to score just the release paper on the backside or the release plastic so that I can leave part of the release liner on the back portion, that bottom couple of inches. And that's going to enable me later on to be able to integrate any of the siding below. And that gets back to that code section where you have to drain all of your flashing out to the surface of your cladding. And this is going to help me to be able to do that. Then I backfold the piece after I've made that score so that I can ensure that I've got 2 separate pieces and there are no little hairs of that backing sheet that are still stuck to the lower portion. Now I got a little video if this works. This was a video we did at the Builders Show of the Olfa top sheet cutter. So I'm just going to play this, see if it works, and that way you can see an alternative to using a sharp knife. There's actually a tool for that. It's got a knife blade which extends 1/32 of an inch when you push the slide button up. You can kind of see it here. It sticks out a tiny, tiny bit. And then on the back side over here, it's got a pressure slide. And what that does is, depending on where it is, it puts pressure on the tip of the blade. So it will sort of control the depth. So if I'm cutting through the thicker paper backing material on, say, like this DuPont scrap or grapes and water shield, I'll push that all the way up. And now when I make a cut, it cuts just through the paper and it doesn't cut through. Oops. Well, that's funny. I can hear it, but it sounds like some people can't hear it. With this thinner plastic release paper, I'll dial this slide back just a little bit, and then when I go down and I cut, it just scores through, and it doesn't go, again, through and into the adhesive, and now I can peel that off. Now, not that you'd ever do a curved line, but if you want to get an inside corner really tight, this is the way to go, because you can make a nice straight cut with a straight edge, and then you can peel that off, the release paper. You can leave the other piece on, and now I can fly in that sticky side into that inside corner, bond it to, say, a wall, then lift up the other portion that goes down, say, on a roof, peel that release paper off, and then stick it down. It's got a nice... Well, don't know if everybody could hear that or not. I tried to curl my microphone into the headset to see if it would help.
Yeah, we could hear that. Once you put the boom in, we could hear it. Yeah, it was just coming through your headphones.
Sorry about that. So basically, it was a tool that it's a knife, that specialty knife is made for cutting coupons. That actually works really good for scoring the backing sheet without cutting through the face of the material. So now you can see it peeling off most of the release paper, the large piece, leaving the release paper down at the bottom, and then sticking that up on the wall. Make sure that the top you've got about an inch or two that's going to be above where the top of the ledge is going to go. And then the bottom edge will stick down an inch or two or maybe 3 down below where the bottom of the ledger would go. When you are applying, since I'm only cutting these pieces like 3 to 5 feet long, I'm going to be overlapping the pieces successively down the run of the length of the ledger. I'm going to make an overlap between those sheets of about 3 or 4 inches. And then the important thing here is that where the end of the ledger is going to go, which right now is that vertical cut in the house wrap, I want to make sure that this peel and stick is going to go 3 to 6 inches past the end of the ledger board. And you'll see later on at the very last couple slides why that's important. Basically, it backs up the butt joint between the ledger board and the siding that gets installed later on. So here we're just attaching the ledger board. You're going to have to snap a chalk line over the top just to control the height of the ledger where you're going to want that to be. But I've got 1 to 3 inches above, 2 to 3 inches below, and then 3 to 6 off the end. Now I need to prepare a second piece, and this is going to be the piece that goes on top of the ledger board, and it's going to serve a couple functions. One, it's going to be the backup to the metal flashing, and the other purpose is as a isolation membrane that if I use a metal flashing, it's going to isolate the pressure treated lumber from the metal flashing so we don't have any galvanic reaction going on. Now this piece here, I want to make it the width well, it's going to need a wall leg, and it's going to need a portion that's going to go over the top of the ledger and then down a little bit on the face of the ledger. So figuring that I like to have 6 to 8 inches up for a wall leg and then 2 to 3 inches to go over the top of the ledger and then a ½ inch to say 1.5 inches down the front of the ledger board. I'm going to make this anywhere from an 8-inch wide piece to say a 12-inch wide piece. And then 2 to 3 inches from the bottom edge or one of the edges, I'm going to make that same score with a sharp knife or with that top sheet cutter. And that way I can position it on top of the ledger board. Now the backing sheet's on the wall section, and the backing sheet is right now on the portion that'll come down over the ledger board that you see facing me as I'm putting it in to get a nice tight position on there before I peel off the release sheet. Then I pull the piece off, and you could do it either the wall section first or the top of the ledger section first. I like to do the top of the ledger first. I'm going to peel that off and then bond it down to the top of the ledger board and then seal it down onto the face, and then make really sure that when I peel the release paper off the portion that'll be the wall leg, that I get a tight inside press on the inside corner. I don't want to bridge the inside corner between the top of the ledger board and the wall itself. Otherwise, I could have a problem where that could get punctured because it's just airspace behind it, especially when you're working with some thinner self-adhere membrane. Now you can use the self-adhere membrane I'm using here, just a couple of different pieces of different brand products. These are all asphalt based. That's fine. If you're going to use butyl based, to make sure you do butyl based for both. You don't want to mix butyl and asphalt together. Sometimes they don't play well together, so you want to be compatible. You can use regular ice barrier membrane, like the 3-foot wide sheets you could use up on a roof as your ice barrier, or you can just use sheets that come off the roll at the width that you need. So I've got a whole variety of pieces that I've got in one of my sheds, and I just pick and choose and grab whatever I need that's going to suit the job. Then after I've pulled off that release paper, bond that up on the wall, and then at the very corner, there's going to be the portion at the end of the ledger. Just going to make a little relief cut and then fold the piece down around the end of the ledger and then onto the wall. And then successive pieces going in the same sequence, the bottom sheet strip, removing that off so it goes to the top of the ledger, and then the second piece being up onto the wall, and then work your way down whatever it is, 16 foot, 20 foot, 30 foot long ledger board. Then putting a metal cap flashing on top of that. Now this could be a metal or a plastic cap flashing. You notice that this has a fairly tall back leg on it. This one's probably got about a 5-inch wall leg. That would be the minimum height. I like to go usually with a 6 to an 8-inch tall back leg on the wall. I'll show you why in a minute. Then that's going to get fastened in place. I went to my local lumber yard to see what they had in stock for what they would call ledger flashing. The one on the left, it's an 1.5 inch mill finish aluminum flashing. It has an 1.5 inch tall wall leg. Definitely not tall enough. Now you could install counter flashing over that, just another piece of aluminum or galvanized steel or copper or whatever you like over the top of that. That would work, but you do need some additional flashing that would go up the wall. You're not going to be able to count on the house wrap and the siding to be able to cover over that sufficiently. So you need to extend a metal or plastic leg up taller. The one on the right is this was a galvanized steel flashing, which has a painted coating on it, and it has a 4-inch leg, and that was the tallest that they had. I would say neither of these you could use independently on their own. You would definitely need to have a counter flashing if you were going to use either of those. An additional thing to point out on the one on the left, it fails, and many of the lumberyard stocked and big box store stock flashings fail for both ledger flashing and for window flashing and for roof flashing and a bunch of other cases because it's too thin. This is only 11 thousandths of an inch thick, and almost all flashings that you use on a house have to meet that 19 thousandths of an inch. You don't think there's a lot of difference between 11 thousandths of an inch and 19 thousandths. It's only 8 thousandths of an inch, but that's almost 50% thinner than it's supposed to be. So pay attention to the thickness of the flashing because it does have an impact on durability. The one on the right is 26 gauge galvanized steel coated, so it is thick enough. The reason you need a tall back leg is because the siding requires an exposure above your finished decking. Now figure you've got deck boards that are going on there that could probably be an inch thick, maybe even thicker. And then depending on the cladding you're using, it's going to have a prescribed height that you have to leave off the top of the deck surface, in which case you don't want to be looking at the house wrap or some self-adhere membrane. You want to be seeing some primary flashing, be it plastic or metal. So here's a list of the different siding materials, common siding materials, and what is required either by manufacturers or by industry associations. So if you're using vinyl siding, you need a minimum of a 3/4 of an inch gap. Cedar lap siding, so cedar clapboard, that is prescribed by the Western Red Cedar Association, the WRCLA. They require a minimum of 2 inches, and I just verified that just yesterday to be sure. The Cedar Shingle and Shake Bureau govern Western Red Cedar shingles, and that they require a 1/2 inch minimum. If you're using white cedar, then that would be prescribed by the white cedar manufacturers, since they don't have an association that governs their installation. So whether it's SBC, Wasco, Maybach, or any of those, you check with their instructions. Most of those are calling for, when I looked at them, between a 1/2 of an inch and an inch. Fiber cement siding will be by the manufacturer, and depending on the manufacturer will be 1 inch to 2 inches. Hardy fiber cement, for instance, requires 2-inch exposure there above the deck. And then composite wood siding, depending on, and that would go for composite wood trim as well. That would be by manufacturer. Most of them that I looked at, like LP Smart Side, for instance, they required a 1-inch space. Those get overlooked a lot of times, and because most carpenters like to see things tight, they like to have either the siding go down and the deck board go up to it, or they like to see the siding come down tight on top of the deck board, but really that's not proper. You don't find too many building officials that are enforcing this, because it is enforceable by the code, that exposure there, but it is up to us to do that, and it's just good building practice to do it. And that's the reason why you need a tall back leg, because you figure you're already going to lose an inch to the deck boards, and then if you had say fiber cement and you need a 2-inch space there, then you're going to need at least 3 inches just to the bottom of the siding, and then your top lap there, you'd want to have at least 2 inches and preferably more on an overlap with your siding and so on. So just a way to get you to think about the flashing that you're going to use. So what I usually do is I make my own siding up, and that way I can choose the height that I need. There are other flashing profiles that you can use. I'm showing in my slides here, let me go back. I'm showing a flashing, which is like a cap flashing that comes down over the top of the ledger and then has a drop leg down on the face. That works fine. But if you're going to use a type of flashing that extends out over the top of the joist, and this is common in some parts of the country, it's done for a couple of different reasons. One reason, and it's a good reason, is to shield the joist hangers from getting water flowing over them. We know there's a galvanic reaction that can take place between the pressure treated lumber and even the G185 coated hardware. To minimize the galvanic reaction, if you reduce the amount of water that that piece of hardware is getting exposed to, you can increase the lifespan of that. And by putting that flashing extending out, that will shield that hardware from seeing very much water. On the downside, if you extend that flashing out more than where the joint between your first deck board and your second deck board out from the wall are going to be, that's going to be a debris trap. And if you get debris collecting in there, you can grow all kinds of things. And a friend of mine sent me a picture of a deck he was working on last year, and it had a small maple tree starting to grow up. It was about 4 inches high. But the same thing's also going to happen at the back here where the wall occur, where the flashing's hitting the wall and the deck board on top of that. So we really got to think about how to drain water at that point. It's not something you often think about, draining water over the flashing, because you're counting on that flashing to, shield everything under it from getting water to the ledger board. But you also got to think about the water draining over that flashing under the deck board so you don't end up with debris collecting. Not all homeowners take it not all homeowners are very meticulous at maintenance, so it's a good idea to make things a little more maintenance free for them. So what I like to do, if I'm going to use that type of flashing where it extends out over the joist top, is to use either some cedar shingles, or if you don't like the idea of having a wrap, well, let me explain what's going to happen here. If you put a cedar shingle over the top of the joist and the top of the flashing, and these only have to be 1.5 inches or 2 inches wide, you'll elevate the flashing, you'll elevate the decking off of the flashing so the water can flow down behind the deck board, provided you leave like a 1/2 inch gap there. So water will flow down, it'll help the debris to flow down, you won't be trapping moisture or decaying debris there that can't be washed out easily with a hose. But the problem you end up with is if you're just using a 16-inch tall shingle, is you will be kicking up those last 2 or 3 deck boards by 3/8 of an inch over the course of that 16 inches. Not a big deal. I've done it. I just did it on a deck that my helper and I were refitting with some new deck boards, and you really don't even notice it. But if you don't like the idea of that rapid transition up to 3/8 of an inch, then what you can do is just take some pressure treated, scraps, or just a leftover board, say it was a 6-foot or a 4-foot pressure treated 2x, just rip it into taper strips, and that way you can have that transition extend further out, be it 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, whatever you feel comfortable with. But the idea there is, if you get that flashing to have a space with the deck board, it's going to help out a lot. One of the things I do whenever I set up, because I do like to put a cap flashing on, and I don't generally put that extended flashing over the top of the joist, what I do like to do is drop my ledger boards 1/2 of an inch. And that way I can make the cap flashing have a wall leg, and instead of having a 90-degree bend on it, I bend it at like about maybe a 5% or a 10% slope, and I let that slope downwards, and that way it enables you to bring the deck joist that 1/2 inch higher than the deck ledger board. If you hold the first deck board off of the wall by a 1/2 or 3/4 of an inch, which you're really not going to notice anyway, and that way water can flow down behind the deck board against the wall section, and then under the deck board, and then down over the ledger board itself. So just different things to think about. Whatever way you want to approach it, just think about how you get the water to flow over that cap flashing without trapping it by the deck board. It's just going to help everything move better. Then the house wrap comes down over the top. If you're using one of the WRB integrated sheathings, what I would recommend at this point is to use a fluid applied system and just tape that in, and then paint it in. Or if you want, just use another piece of flashing tape over the top of the metal flashing to tie it into the sheathing, and then just use whatever brand tape that corresponds with that sheathing so that it will wet in properly to the WRB coating on the sheathing. Just like a head flap on a door or a window, just tape off that diagonal corner where the house wrap folds down over that upper portion. And now I'm going to bring the siding up from underneath the bottom of the flashing. Now this wouldn't be the case if you had a grade level deck where it's just going to have the foundation down below that. You don't have to worry about that because it would just be dripping over the foundation. But if you got siding coming up underneath, bring the siding until next to the last piece, lifting up that portion of the ledger board that was, excuse me, not the ledger board, but lifting up the piece of the self-adhered membrane that was extending down below the ledger board that I left a relief sheet on. And now I can extend that flashing tape over the top of the siding and then trim it off for either the last piece of siding or the trim. So you're not going to let that stick down and be exposed. You're going to trim it off 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch higher. And then you can install, in this case, I've just got a ripped down piece of clapboard that's going to trim that off, and that'll cover it up. Now, some people worry about putting that piece of trim or siding directly over that flashing tape because they're afraid that they might be trapping water should it weep around the bottom of the ledger board and back to the wall and hit that membrane. If you're worried about trapping moisture in there, then what you can do is just take some toothpick size pieces of splinters of wood that you carve off of a scrap and then tuck those under that piece of trim or siding after you tack it on over that self-adhered membrane. Now you notice over here at the very end that we've got the self-adhered membrane, that 3 to 6 inches that I let it extend past the end of the ledger board. That is a joint that you'll have later on when you bring the siding in and butt up to the end of the ledger board. And by having that membrane extend, you don't have to worry about that butt joint should you either caulk it or leave it unsealed. That water getting into that joint will end up flowing down behind the siding at this point, because you've got that membrane over the top of the siding. It's going to enable the water to flow in that joint down and get cast out onto the surface of the siding where it's not going to do any harm. Think of that like you would a slip sheet or a joint backing sheet of either tar paper or a piece of sheet metal or a piece of plastic that you might put between the butt joint for regular in the field butt joints of clapboard or any type of lap siding when you install it. So it's serving the same function there. So this would be where I put that, where the butt of the siding will go up against the ledger board and against that trim piece down there, and that's kicked out on top. All right, we got some alternatives. So that's the big thing with the flashing, but I want to look at some of the alternative ways to deal with ledger boards and manage the water. Here's one way, and this is allowed by the code. In fact, the code tables for fastening your ledger board include a section on spacing the ledger board 1/2 inch off of the wall using a 1/2 inch stack of washers. This allows you for the 1/2 inch of sheathing, and then you would have a 1/2 inch space. And then what you need to think about, though, is how you're going to protect the wall behind the ledger board. You could use aluminum coil stock. I like to use some coil PVC stock, some trim stock. bendable PVC, and I'll just run that through there. You could also use a piece of self-adhered flashing tape, provided it's the type that is UV stable, so that it can be exposed at this upper portion here where you may have the siding coming down. So you could use the self-adhered membrane there, or you could run the self-adhered membrane, and then where the upper part here where you would have the deck board spaced a little bit back where sunlight could hit that ordinary flashing tape, you could just put a piece of aluminum coil stock just to cover where the sunlight would be able to hit that. As long as you got something back there that's going to protect the wall sheathing and keep the water out of the wall, that's all that's required. What some contractors like to do when they space the ledger off with a stack of washers is they'll put a bead of sealant there before they put the through bolts through, and that way when you tighten up the bolts, the compression of the washers to that membrane or to the aluminum coil stock or plastic coil stock will prevent the water from getting in. There's some people, yeah, I see the question there.
Okay,
what stops the water from entering at the washers? Yep. There's, this is so I've tried this on a couple of projects where I put no sealant just to see what would happen. And then I sprayed water at it. And I just kept the hose there for going for quite a while. And we didn't see any water getting in. When you get those washers in compression, the chance of water getting in there is pretty minimal. And if you put a bead of sealant there before you compress the it's used in lots of parts of the country. Well, I won't say lots. It's used in some parts of the country almost exclusively, which is why it got included in the code. But it's not for everybody because of that concern. This is what it would look like. This is the plastic coil stock that I use, and I just run it back there, and then the washers are back there. You can't really see them in this mock-up detail. There are systems that are made for this spacer. One of them is a deck-to-wall spacer that I'm showing here. And the way these work is they take the place of the stack of washers. You back screw these little hockey puck-sized discs onto your ledger board, and then you would actually dry fit the ledger onto the wall, so you can pre-drill the holes through the into the wall, and then you can see here where they've installed a spludge of sealant on the in this case a membrane that's going back there, so that when the bolts go through and you tighten those bolts up, it's got a big face of that deck to wall spacer that the sealant is basically sealing that connection. Now there are two types of these fasteners or these spacers. One is made for 1/2-inch through bolts, and the other is made for structural screws. So you don't even have to use through bolts with this connection. Both Fasten Master and Simpson Strong Tie allow for, now you have to dig into their technical bulletins to find this, but they both allow for their screws to be used with a modified fastener pattern for the Fasten Master's ledger locks, as well as the Simpson Strong Tie SDWS and SDWH screws. So you just follow the patterns that they call for, and you can create that space using screws. Now, this isn't something that you'll find in the code book. This is something you need to show your building official that you're following the fastener manufacturer's installation instructions and their engineering data that's behind that, and make sure they're going to approve that your local official is going to approve that. Somebody made note in the question and answer that you're probably getting a thermal break there as well when you install the ledger over these fasteners where you're spacing it off. And yes, that's the case. And what I'm going to move to now is showing you, if you want a real thermal break, there are some other devices you can use that create that same space, but give you a much bigger space that you can actually install some exterior insulation over and get even more thermal value out of that. So this is the main deck bracket, and I use this, I've used it on quite a few jobs, and it enables you to not only put additional insulation over the wall and then put the insulation around the flange that's on here, but you can also run your cladding, your regular siding right through it. What I like to do when I install these is I'll put them on the wall at the framing stage, or I've also done them as retrofits. It's a little more difficult depending on the type of siding you're putting on, but you can just flash that right into your wall system and then attach the ledger board, or if you want, and then install your exterior insulation, exterior siding after you put the ledger board, or you can install the exterior insulation before you put the ledger board on. So whichever way you want to do it, you can just do it with the regular progress of your installation of the your exterior insulation and siding and ledger, depending on what the sequence is that you're following. The nice thing with these is they have an ICC evaluation service report, and they're rated for 1,000 pound capacity each. You just have to follow the manufacturer's instructions, and you can find that at, I think it's called deckbracket.com. There are other systems as well. This is the BR brick bracket. Now it's made for installing when you are going to be putting regular veneer brick with a 1-inch airspace behind it, which is great. But it can also be used if you're going to install ledger where you want to either have the siding going down behind the ledger board all the way through, or the way I use it is if I'm going to be installing exterior insulation over the wall. So it just gives you an extra thickness. Now the main deck bracket only has about a 3¼ inch or 3½ inch space that you can get out of that extension. The BR brick bracket, I think, has 5¼ inches. This does not have an ICC evaluation service report, so you'd have to, though they do have an engineering test report, so you just have to submit the engineering test report to your local official if you're going to use that. Then there's another one that does have an ICC evaluation service report. This is the Metwood deck bracket. It's been on the market for a few years. Again, like the BR brick bracket, it's made for installing with a brick veneer with an airspace behind it. It has about a 5-inch throw between the wall attachment flange and the flange that you would connect your ledger board to. It has a little leg that sticks out at the bottom to help support that ledger, but you also drive some machine screws that come with the kit into the face of this that support the ledger board, and then that gives you that full support, or that gives you the 5 or so inch space off of there that you could put insulation back there or run your siding. So there are some other options if you want to side the ledger off the wall without having to run cap flashing over the top. But there again, you could, and you can think about this for people who are concerned about the way you're making this attachment here and then putting flashing tape over it, and maybe that might leak, or you're concerned about that. You can also think about, if you aren't using it for the purpose that it's intended, which is brick veneer, you could install this, run your exterior insulation up behind it, but break your exterior insulation at this point, and then put a cap flashing with a wall leg against the wall sheathing that comes out over the top of that bracket and then down over the face of the ledger board. So you can still use these with the normal, what you think of as a cap flashing, but it gives you the opportunity to attach a ledger, though this session isn't really intended as a ledger flash, as a ledger attachment system, a ledger attachment presentation. I'm really presenting these as options for flashing, but you can also integrate these with a conventional flashing. So just take it as an option there. Moving on to cantilevered floor joists. These, I remember 30 years ago, the first time I was framing a house where we sistered the pressure treated deck joists alongside the house floor joist, and we let these stick out about 4 feet without any outside support. It was a little balcony off of a door, off of a master bedroom. And we didn't really think a whole lot about flashing. We just butt our clapboard to it and we ran some silicone, and that was it. And when I think back to that, I'm thinking, I just cringe every time I think now what I did back then, because chances are the water got in after that silicone deteriorated, whether it was a year later or 5 years later. Since then, I've used a bunch of different systems, and it wasn't until flexible flashing tape came out that I really had something that I felt pretty comfortable doing myself. Before I had the flexible flashing tape, I used to have a local metal worker guy who did copper work actually fabricate up saddle flashings, one that went up around the bottom of the joist from the bottom, one that went down from the top. But those are expensive, especially if you have 5 or 6 floor joists out. Now with flexible flashing tape, you can basically do it yourself, and it's done much the same way as you would doing a penetration that goes through the wall. So I start out with some flexible flashing tape, and there's any number of those made for windows and doors that you can grab, that whether they're asphalt based or butyl based, as long as it's going to be compatible with the house wrap or the weather resistant barrier integrated sheathing. Here what I've done is taken a piece of the flexible flashing tape that's about 4 inches wide and about a foot long, maybe a little bit longer if you've got 2x12 joists. And then down the middle, I use the same either sharp knife trick, or I use a sharp knife trick, or I use the top sheet cutter to score the back of that release paper so that I can separate the release paper in 2 steps. So I remove the release paper on one portion of that, and that's going to wrap around the bottom of the joist and up around the sides. And then I press it tight against the side of the joist, and you can see how on the side there that it's extending about 2/3 of the way up on the left and the right side of those joists. You don't want to just make it so it only goes halfway up. You want to make it go a good portion of the way up, and then the mating piece from the top will give you an overlap there. Then after you've bonded it to the joist, then you can pull the second part of the release paper off and then flare it down over your house wrap or your weather resistant barrier integrated sheathing. Then make a second piece identical to the top, and then cut a little head flap in your WRB. And that second piece, the same sequence. You're going to take part of the release paper off and leave part on, drape that down over the top, and then press it down tight against the sides, pull that second piece off, and then fold and bond that up onto the wall under that head flap. And then the head flap comes down, and then you tape over that at the corner to give you this pretty good, weather tight flashing around the side of the joist. Now these tapes, of course, are not made for exposure to sunlight, and even though it's going to be under your deck, there might be a little bit of sunlight peeking through at the joints in the decking. So what I recommend is to take a piece of coil stock, or a thin piece of wood, or a piece of plastic coil stock, something that you're going to be able to wrap around and over that. Not only does it shield it from the sun, it also gives it a more attractive appearance, especially if there's going to be space below where people will be walking beneath these joists and looking up at them. You don't want them to see the flashing tape because it might be a little bit wrinkly if you didn't do a good job installing it. And then the siding can butt right to that. And then use whatever sealant you want between the end of the siding and that metal. It's really only there to fill the gap, as for painting purposes. It's not really there as a seal. The seal is back here at the flashing tape level. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about, and we're got 10 minutes or so for questions if anybody's got any, or if Justin, if you've got any questions or comments, be happy to take those.
One thing I wanted you to talk about, Mike, was when you were talking about the stacked washers. Um, what is the method you use to logistically get those stacked washers into place?
Yeah, what I found works best, and you can see it here with the deck to wall spacer, where what they do is they have little screws that drive in. So what I'll do with the washers when I've tried it is I take the washers and first off I use some what do you call it? Yeah, you're always drawing a blank. That's my age showing. Uh, some you know it's the CA adhesive.
Oh, like a
Oh,
super glue.
yeah, that's it. Super glue. You know, I tell you, I'm doomed at my age. Yeah, super glue them together. And then I take a piece of just regular house wrap tape and I just
Yeah.
tape it to the back side of the ledger board. I've tried doing it without super gluing them together. The problem is they kind of shift in that little group because I think it's like 5 washers or 6 washers to make up the ½ inch. And if they shift just a little tiny bit and you don't glue them together, what happens is the bolt, when you try to push it through, ends up banging against one of them and you're just pulling your hair out.
Right.
So super gluing this together, or if you've got time and you're not in a rush, you could just use any type of adhesive and then just stack them up with whatever, panel adhesive or something, and just make the little pile of them.
Okay. You couldn't set that up so that the bolts are coming, so that the nuts are on the outside of the ledger, could you?
Uh,
Like basically reverse those fasteners that you have in the
Oh,
drawing?
you could, yeah, you could put the head of the bolt on the inside and have them protruding out. But what I've only tried doing that when I tried the lateral load connectors that way, when we pre-install them from the outside. The trouble is orienting the ledger to those bolts when they're sticking out and not having the bolts push back in.
Oh, right.
Because, your hole on this is a problem that some people might think, well, I'll oversize the hole in the ledger board and make it a 3/4 inch hole, and then I'll just, have plenty of play. But the hole going through the ledger board can be no more than a 1/16 of an inch bigger than the diameter of the bolt. So it can only be 9/16 of an inch.
Okay. Looks like you have a couple more questions in the
Yep.
chat box there.
Let's see. So let's see, we'll start out. What about installing a piece of bent metal flashing on top of the ledger? So I think I did do that earlier. That works just fine.
He was at that specific when he asked that question. He was
Oh,
talking about the spaced out ledger assembly
oh,
here
yes.
as a way to
Right.
protect those leakage points around the
Yep,
washers.
you can do that. That's what I was getting to when I was talking about those other deeper flashings, the spacers, like the main deck bracket. You can put a flashing over the top and put a cap flashing. Yep, no problem. That works fine. Let's see, potential for, thought it was worth mentioning. Okay, here's one. Thought it was worth mentioning separating the deck completely from the home and add some additional footings. Okay, so if you don't want to have to do any flashing at all, and you want to have really thick exterior insulation that goes beyond those 2 fastening systems that I showed you, the BR brick bracket or the Met wood bracket, that get us up to 5 inches of space there. Say you wanted 8 inches of foam on the outside, you can put a freestanding deck. There's nothing to stop you from doing a freestanding deck, and that would completely eliminate any need for any flashing. And then if you do want to make a connection for lateral load, you can just use back to the house. You can just put the lateral load connectors with a long fastener through and into the house to give you some stability to an elevated deck without doing independent bracing. That would help the lateral load, but that's really not supporting the load of the deck. The load of the deck would be on additional footings. So yep, that's a perfectly good option. Let's see, what's the flashing detail for the brick bracket after the brick is installed? Well, if you're using that BR brick bracket, you don't have any additional flashing there. You would just run the brick all the way through where the ledger is connected to the BR brick bracket. There are some bolts that go through, and you just put some sealant around those. Let's see, could you get a bushing from McMaster car. I guess yes. You can get any sort of, if you have a thicker spacer you want to use for that spacer, you could use whatever you like there. The only thing is the code only allows you up to a half of an inch space, presuming that you've got a 1-inch sheathing on the wall. Excuse me, half-inch sheathing on the wall. You're only allowed a 1-inch maximum space from the rim joist face to the back side of the ledger board. How and where do you find all of the unique options for ledger mounting hardware? I've seen the main deck brackets and the hockey pucks, but not the others. So the other two are the Metwood deck bracket. We did a blog post on Fine Homebuilding last year about the Metwood bracket and the BR brick bracket. I think I did a blog post about them a couple years ago, and I don't know if those have been coupled with the new deck section for the deck project guide or not. We'll have to look and see if those got included, and if not, we can put those over there so people could find them. So I think we're up on all the questions so far. Any other questions? Okay.
All right, great. Well, Mike, thanks. Thanks so much for walking us through this. We should remind people that you have a very long series that we shot this year, all phases of deck construction that go through a lot of different options. It's part of our shop class series. That's all up on YouTube, and it's on finehomebuilding.com. And this will be the first of many webinars featuring you.
And we got a webinar we're planning for next week.
Yep.
We haven't picked the date, but that will be on a site-built underdeck drainage system.
Correct.
We'll kind of follow along the article that I did in Fine Homebuilding, and that from like 7 or 8 years ago, and I'm hoping to get some more video and or some more photos to be able to add to that, so we can go into it a little bit deeper.
Right.
And if anybody's got other questions and wants to follow up, they can just send them in to Fine Homebuilding through either the podcast or just through the regular page, and we can get back to you. Yep. And if you're not already listening to the Fine Homebuilding podcast, sign up for that. I listen to it every week, and I enjoy that immensely.
And to answer Dale's question, yes, this will be available after the webinar is over. It'll probably be on our site, and we'll send you a link to all the attendees will get a link to it.
Okay, great.
All right, guys. Thanks very much.
Take care.